Yeah, okay. We can go. So, well, actually, it's only 5 past, isn't it? So that's fine. The usual. I'm Tony Barnes. Presumably, I'm co-director of the Centre. I'm going to chair this evening's session. Andy is going to be giving us a lecture on Volume 2 of Capital, and hopefully we'll have at least half an hour at the end to have a chat about it, and I'll lead the discussion. Okay, over to you, Andy.
Let me just check. Sorry, because I came in late. I need the what's its status? Can I share my screen? Co-host status.
Okay. Can I do that? Allow.
We should normally just run a check at the beginning, but I was late.
How do I do that then?
On the participants against me.
Yeah, there's
I've
three
just done it
dots.
now. You should be able to share.
Oh, thank you, Oliver. Thanks, mate.
Oh, well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
No.
Okay, welcome everybody. It helps if you turn off your mics. There's sometimes extraneous noise which affects, well, my concentration, but also the recording. Quiet at the back. That's what that kind of. Right. Okay. Now I've got some extraneous stuff coming up, so we're not really started yet. Just hang on 1 minute while this system stuff clears out the way. I really hope this will all get edited out. There's still some background sound coming from somewhere. We've got background sound and front ground video at the moment, so we just have to be patient a minute. Arne?
Yeah.
Or Tony? Oh, some mics are on. Okay, thank you everybody for your patience. As Tony Burns rightly said, this is the lecture 4 of the series that we're doing on Marx's Capital Volume 2. And this is the second of actually 3 lectures on part 2. And this lecture is going to cover chapters 12 to 15, which concern circulation time and production time. And as is my habit, I'm going to do a bit of a review. The reason for the review is partly just to sort of read us back into this material, which is quite dense and demanding, but also it allows me the opportunity, at least, and I hope you guys in the discussion, to sort of reflect on how we looked at the previous text we were looking at. So, and then the main part of I will go over the content of these chapters 12 to 15. And in particular, I think chapter 15 is the sort of highlight of this group. So I want to make sure we get to that and give it the attention it deserves. And the other things are sort of like wrap up, really, that I have been looking more at some of the literature, and we can reflect on that, especially in the discussion. Okay. There's a basic error in classical political economy, which is sort of Smith and Ricardo, which Marx has very clearly explained to us, which is and the error continues to this day. So it's a sort of a demarcation line between bourgeois view of capitalist production and Marx's explanation of what's really going on. And that is the confusion between the categories of fixed and circulating capital with the categories that Marx gives of constant and variable capital. And constant and variable capital, Marx has looked at in very clear categorical terms in Volume 1. And variable capital is that portion of the capital which is invested to buy use of the commodity labor power. And it's called variable capital, not because it can go up and down, because wages do go up and down, but because the commodity that it buys is the unique commodity, which is that it produces more new value than its own exchange value. So it's a very unique combination of use value and value. The use value of the commodity labor power is that it creates when it's consumed new value. And that's the portion of capital that's invested to pay for it. So Marx's schema in volume 2, he extends his first distinction between constant and variable capital, which are part of the value creation process or the valorization process in production. And the reason Marx highlights this distinction is because it's a step in a related ensemble of concepts, which shows that labor is exploited because it produces far more value than it gets in return for its labor power. So the distinction between constant and variable capital is completely consistent with and necessary for a concept of the capitalist mode of production as a class exploitation mode of production. So what Marx does from this sort of essential relation is he builds from production into circulation, which is what he comes to in volume 2. And in volume 2, we see this distinction as a second distinction now between circulating capital, where the value that is transferred into the commodity product is completely passed over and realized when that commodity product is sold. So in particular, things like raw materials, ancillary products as well, which go into the coal, which is burnt, while the electricity that runs and so on, while the commodities are formed. They don't physically go into the product, but their value does. And he distinguishes this circulating capital, whose value is transferred into the commodity product in totality during one turnover. That is to say, during the time which it takes to produce and to sell this product. That is contrasted with fixed capital, which is things like the machinery, the raw materials, the buildings, etc. General term for which Marx uses is means of labor. And here, the value is passed over, but if you like, step by step over several years. I mean, 10, 15, 20, 30 years it could be. Okay, so this is how constant capital value is transferred by these two subdivided methods, if you like, of transfer. Now, variable capital for Marx is by definition, if you like, circulating capital, because workers' wages are paid for the hire of the worker for a given period of time. So capital employs the worker, they employ them, they set them to work. They don't own them as a full human being. What they own is the right to use their labor power for a certain period of time. And so labor power in commodified in this way, in this social construct, which is the most typical one in capitalism, which is the wage labor contract, is a component of circulating capital. So Marx has got these constant and variable, but also constant can be fixed or circulating. Now, what classical political economy had was a collapse of these categories, and it collapsed the distinction between circulating capital as variable capital with circulating capital as constant capital. In other words, it just had a distinction between circulating and fixed. All right. So the distinctive, unique character of labor power as a commodity, that which is the source of new value, begins to disappear, begins to get lost. It doesn't completely lost in classical political economy. In fact, what they end up with is a sort of inconsistent and self-contradictory system, because in different ways, both Adam Smith and Ricardo agreed with the labor theory of value. So they didn't actually, if you like, rather than explain contradiction, they ended up with theoretical inconsistency. And Marx goes quite fully into Adam Smith's version of this. And he says that, well, Adam Smith actually doesn't get circulating capital and fixed capital quite right. He positions them as like fixed points, fixed categories, if you like, of capital invested either in production or in a selling and buying of goods. And furthermore, Adam Smith confuses what Marx defines as variable capital by putting it in terms of a labor fund, in terms of what the workers consume, with the money which they've been paid as their wages to buy the commodities which they consume. So he moves actually the definition away from being a component of capital and being a category of income for the workers. So, I mean, this is quite a lot of confusion. Of course, it's only in retrospect with Marx's sort of clear and more consistent analysis, deeper analysis, that these confusions sort of become explained. So they're not really self-explanatory. It's just a more confused account in the work of Smith and indeed Ricardo. So this is a major departure from classical political economy. And it's what Marx is doing is he's not sacrificing the labor theory of value as the essential relation to the forms in which capitalism actually works. He's actually explaining how this essential relation is manifest in the appearance in this, and this is how the contradictions of capitalist production appear in market relations of circulation. So he's very consciously using this sort of dialectical reconstruction, this methodology of how essence is manifest, how it appears. So in Smith's concept, as I've already mentioned, we've got capital invested in circulation versus capital fixed in production. Now, what Marx is drawing on is what he's told us a lot about in part 1 of volume 2, is that this is thinking of a river as being only just 2 points along the river, rather than thinking of the river as what the water that flows along the river, right? In other words, the water has to go past both points. And he's seeing capital as a flow here, right? It's not a perfect analogy because this is a river that expands as it goes, right? But the point is there is also a flow. So the whole point about the metamorphosis of industrial capital is that every element of capital that's invested goes through these different stations on its journey, these different functional forms. Capital first spends money on commodities, they're put into production, which produces new commodities, which are then sold, and they're returned to money capital. And every element does go through this cycle. Of course, if you take a snapshot at any given time, then you only see the sort of the pattern of the different elements. So you've got this very sophisticated combination, which Marx does theoretically reconstruct. And his argument is that the distinction between fixed and circulating capital is not a distinction between capital in production and capital in circulation, right? Rather, it's a distinction that arises within production and the different roles that the means of labor and the object of labor and labor itself take within productive capital, and how they yield their value over time. They all go through production, they all go through circulation, but how they go through these different phases is different according to the categories concerned. So there's a theoretical confusion of Smith, and what lies behind it is it buries the specificity of surplus value as the source of profit. Now, Marx hasn't even yet got on to surplus value explicitly, by the way. He's still talking about transfers of constant and variable capital. But what we can see here is the sort of the winter training that Marx put in and we have followed in terms of part 1, this sort of close attention to the metamorphosis of social forms of capital. This is why he did it, right? And you know, on reflection, I mean, I think as a presenter of these ideas, I could have stressed this more from the start. It's something which we've learned. I mean, in other words, there's not a separate critique of political economy on the one hand and an explanation of how the system works on the other, because political economy obscures the way the system works. So in explaining it, he's also critiquing political economy. And this is an interesting subject in his own right, just in terms of how Marx wrote the book, because they did start as parallel strands. And because volume 1 is a more completed work than volume 2, which again is closer to completion than volume 3, I mean, it's a very interesting recent article by a Japanese Marxist who sort of, I think, makes quite a strong case that the way the critique of political economy is integrated into the main text of Capital is sort of more finely tuned in volume 1, and it's a bit clunky in volume 2, and it's not it's not there in volume 3 in the same way at all, actually, right? And so to understand volume 3's theoretical critique, you have to read theories of surplus value alongside volume 3, because the theoretical content is kind of like spread between the two. So, I mean, that's just something to bear in mind, in particular when we read volume 3. But in volume 2, what it means is that some of the chapters are clearly looking at Marx's explanation of the way things work in capitalism, and then another chapter is critique of Smith and Ricardo. And that pattern, by the way, will repeat when we come to part 3 as well. So in terms of how things work, I mean, I'm just going to rehearse what we went through last time. You may or may remember this. I'm taking the second version of this because it's quicker and simpler. So it's one of Marx's examples, and we just pace through it. We just step through it when we have an initial capital invested of 80,000 on fixed capital and 50,000 on circulating capital, under the condition that there's two turnovers of the productive circulating capital in a year, which means that every 6 months the commodity product is sold. And this is I'd all just step through it because we looked at it in detail last time, so I don't intend to go through it in detail. It's just the slight sort of reminder. So I just want to point out a couple of things, emphasize a couple of things here, right? The first is that the amount of value that's produced doesn't change if we change the turnover from its original. In our example, it was 5 turnovers a year of circulating capital to just 2 turnovers a year. What that means is that the commodities that are being produced by a continuous production process are either sold after 6 months and the money comes back, which is the one we've got here, or an alternative case would be that they're sold after just over 2 months and the money comes back quicker. So every 2 months the money comes back. So there's 5 turnovers a year rather than 2 turnovers a year. Now, some things here change and some things don't change, and this is what you've got to keep your eye on, right? The amount of the product value in the commodities does not change in either scenario because it's the same amount of production, the same number of workers, and so on and so forth, right? The capital used up in this one in half a year is 54,000, and so in a whole year it's 108,000. Okay, that's the constant capital and the variable capital used up in the production of a whole year. That doesn't change with different numbers of turnover. That's just a different way of realizing the value and then reinvesting it. That's what turnover affects in our example. So we've got a turnover time of circulating capital affects the amount of circulating capital advanced. When we had 5 turnovers in a year, that meant that only 20,000 was needed to be invested in the circulating capital because it was sold after 2 and a bit months. The money would come back and be reinvested. So that means that the quicker the turnover, the less circulating capital needs to be advanced in the first place, because the longer the turnover, the capitalist has got to keep their production going, and proportionately they just got to keep investing in the wages and the cotton and so on and so forth until they can get their money back and sell the product. So the shorter the turnover, the less circulating capital is needed, all other things being equal, and the longer the turnover of the circulating capital, the more money they have to keep investing to keep it going, right? So if you add that to the fixed capital, that means that the shorter the turnover, the less capital advanced, the longer the turnover, the more capital advanced. And Marx does this because he starts off his concept by saying, what about the overall turnover? How long does it take for the capital advance to come back to the capitalist as revenue? Well, if it was in this case, it's 130,000 has got to come back, right? Now, the amount of product being produced has not changed, remember. It just means it's going to take longer for it to come back than if the turnover was quicker. So it's going to take just over a year, 1.2 years to come back. Now, this is a really interesting ratio, and I'm going to signpost this not only for our understanding now, but for a link forward, a big anticipation for the discussion of this once again in volume 3, when Marx turns the spiral and comes back to this in terms of profitability, right? But what we've got here, in our example, in 1 year, 108,000 K of commodities has been produced, okay? In terms of the transfer value, not the surplus value, 108K. And the capital advance to do that was 130K, right? So the turnover is the ratio between the capital advanced and the capital used up. And that, I'm not even sure, I haven't had time to check this. That has just come to me how significant and sort of slightly hidden that point is. And it's a very important point when we come to volume 3. Just to repeat the point, the aggregate turnover period, it turns out, if you like, is the ratio between the capital advanced, in our example here, 130K, and the capital used up, in our example, 108K. Okay, so that's a relation which we've kind of like unpicked from the trees, and now we're coming back to the wood. So what we're talking about here is a change of form, transfers of value. We are not even yet got to the expansion of value because surplus value has not yet been included in what Marx has been looking at so far. But as an anticipation, this leads on fairly obviously from, I think, from what I've been saying. So in our 2 examples, we've got workers in the production at the same degree, same sort of physical arrangements, if you like, same amount of surplus value being produced. But the only variable has been the turnover. But the longer the turnover, the more capital advance there needs to be. Okay. Now this affects profitability. So we've had our example here of with 5 turnovers, only 100K needs to be invested. With 2 turnovers a year, more money needs to be invested, 130K, right? But this is going to result in different annual rates of profit. The rate of profit is the annual surplus value, which once the commodities have been sold and the surplus value is realized, over the capital advanced. So, but remember the annual surplus value, we haven't actually looked at yet, but let's just suppose a very simple case, which is the typical one which Marx adopts, which is a rate of surplus value of 100%. And let's just say half of the circulating capital was invested in as variable capital in wages and so on. In other words, what we've got is every week during the year, what we've got is 150K, £1,000 a week is invested in the wages, and the workers produce £2,000 a week. So over the year, they produce £50,000 surplus value, which when the goods are sold is profit. However, and that doesn't change with the different turnovers, but what changes is the capital advance. So in the one case with 2 turnovers a year, the rate of profit is 50 over 130. In 5 turnovers a year, the rate of profit is 50 over 100. I mean, the percentages just drop out. Okay. So what we've got is a difference in the rate of profit, which is not directly to do with the rate of exploitation of the workers, right? It's to do with how much capital needed to be advanced in order to the capitalist to take advantage of that exploitation. Okay. So capital advance and turnover are very important aspects to the conversion of the rate of surplus value into the rate of profit. Okay. That's quite a big anticipation. I'm going to come back now, but I wanted to do it because I want to show you where I think the logic of Marx is very patient, step by step, meticulous, very methodical argument, where it's taking us, because otherwise you might give up on the winter show. Wait for the summer. Just keep going. So the other thing that Marx has been talking about is the difference between production time and circulation time. When we talk about turnover, there are 3 major components to it, right? There's a time it takes to buy the commodities to go into production. There's the time of production itself, and then there's the time to sell the commodities and get the money back afterwards, right? Even within production time itself, Marx goes into, as he so does, one might say obsessively, but you'd also say scientifically, goes into the detail of what production time really is. And he distinguishes sort of pauses at the beginning and the end when stuff is being set up to go into production. And depending on the type of industry, there might well be gaps in the active labor process, which are necessary to allow natural processes to bring production of what the commodity is to fruition. I mean, wine making is an obvious one. Cheese might be another one, depending between wine and cheese, what's closest to your taste. So here we have an overall production time, which includes the buying time, the production time, sorry, the overall turnover time, which is constituted by buying time, production time, selling time. Okay, so production time is, if you like, bracketed by two market relations. You're going to take time to buy the stuff, it's going to take time to sell the stuff. Now, in buying and selling, there are different costs involved. And we looked at this in quite a lot of detail. So again, this is purely summary. Marx talks about different types of costs of circulation. And one of the ones which we debated quite a lot or looked at quite a lot is this interesting one of transport. Because he says this is production in the sphere of circulation. And I'm just arrowing that quite a lot, right? So he says it's a particular sort of hybrid, if you like, okay? It's an extension of production, which is hidden in the process of circulation. And I suppose one way you could think about this is whatever the mode of production, it's still a productive act to move the product, doesn't even have to be a commodity, to move the stuff that people want to the place where they want to consume it. That is part of a chain of production. Okay. And Marx sees that as something that adds value rather than realizing value that was previously added. Okay, this is one very big application, of course. All this is very germane to how globalized production is done these days with just-in-time logistics and so on. So extremely prescient of Marx to give attention to this. Now, how far we got on turnover is also quite important. And I know I'm taking a long time in this review, but these are really sort of foundational points to get, right? Chapter 9 explains the distinction between fixed and circulating capital as that which is invested in production. And just to remind you, one is transferred bit by bit, that's fixed, and one is transferred in its entirety. Now, what we haven't looked at, what Marx has not yet done, right, is to see how these different transfers might affect the turnover period, right? What he hasn't done is he hasn't looked at the causes of why it might be 5 turnover times in 1 year or 2 turnover times in 1 year. I mean, it could just be that the stuff is stuck in a warehouse and waiting to be sold, or it could be something integral to that sector of the industry that just takes longer to produce stuff and so on, right? So we don't yet know that. And that's what Marx is going to look at in these immediately following chapters 12 to 15. He's going to look at what in detail, more detail again, what it might be that will affect the turnover time between production time and circulation time. And then another layer again, he is so systematic, so methodical, right? In chapters 16 and 17, he will layer on top of this, the production of surplus value. So this is the first addition is what we'll look at this time. And the next time round, we'll finally get to surplus value. Now, in saying all this, which is quite a long introduction, I do draw on comedic theory here, right? Now, this guy, Stuart Lee, is one of the very, well, in my case, liked comic, right? And he's known as the master of the multiple callback. And it's a technique in stand-up comedy, which is basically apparently long, rambling story, lots of anecdotes, and sort of, where is this going? It appears to be spontaneous. But actually, the comedian begins to wrap it all up in a sort of the final punchlines of the act, and you can see how it all fits together. And oh yeah, the audience, the penny drops, sort of multiple pennies dropping at the same time, right? So it's a culmination, and in retrospect, you realize, oh, this was all part of the design. Okay, so we were talking about jokes earlier. I mean, I do recommend, if you don't already know his stuff, I recommend Stuart Lee 100%. So it's a question of building up to a culmination, right? And the punchline, right? And then that gives the punchline more significance. Okay. Now, the other point to remember here, another comedian, Frankie Boyle, is that the punchline does not have to end in reconciliation. And in fact, this is a particular characteristic of Frankie's humor. It ends in stress, and he comments on his own conscious humor in this way, right? These are comedic intellectuals, by the way. They reflect on what they're doing as social critics through comedy, basically. They're probably the best social critics, you know, in the mainstream media you can find, actually, right? And so what Marx does is he combines both these two things. He builds up towards multiple callback on the one hand. On the other hand, what he's building up towards is not reconciliation, not bringing it all together and tying it all up. On the contrary, what he builds up to is crisis. And that is the crisis of profitability in volume 3, right? So bear this in mind with what we're doing. Now I'm going to go through a bit more of the detail, but you'll read this anyway. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly. We've already talked about this. You can think of these two different types of turnover as not as one business in different states, if you like, but as two completely different industries. And Marx gives the example of cotton spinning, where, you know, the yarn would be sold on a weekly basis, and locomotives take 3 months to build the thing, then you've got to sell it. Okay, so they will have, even if the two factories employ exactly the same number of workers and have invested the same amount of money to set it all up, right, they're going to have different turnover times. Okay, so it's a real life example of the distinction he's talking about. And what he says in this case is 12 times longer to get the money back. So the circulating capital will have to be 12 times as much, right? More capital advanced. Okay. He reviews what he's already told us about fixed and circulating capital. And this is really just emphasizing what we already know. So I'm not, now he brings in another concept here, which is important, right? Matters for the amount of capital required. We have assumed that equal capitals are invested in the spinning and machine building businesses. A difference in the reflux in the same amount of capital laid out, and when the money coming back, basically, the same amount of productive capital is applied both in spinning the mill and machine factory, but the amount of capital laid out is completely different. Okay, so he's making a conceptual distinction here between capital applied, which is how much is spent each week on constant and variable capital, which goes into the production of the product, commodities, right? And how long that is applied for, meaning that more capital will have to be laid out in order to, you know, engage in market sale in the end. Okay, so we've got capital advanced and capital applied. Some examples of difference in turnover period, and the turnover period, you know, changes in different points in the capitalist mode of production. And in the developed capitalist mode of production, he actually did make this point earlier in the text, so I won't go over it greatly. He does make the point, and this is then the latest round. He says he kind of like got a slightly schizophrenic attitude to credit, because he knows that credit's very important for the latest stage of capitalism, and especially credit means the modern corporate form of joint stock companies, right? And as soon as capitalists can borrow money on a large scale, that allows them to expand production, allows them to, you know, keep going with more and more advanced capital on a larger and larger scale. So the relationship between the scale of production, credit, and turnover period in reality are all connected in the modern capitalism of Marxist day. Okay, so this is the idea of you've got to follow the money, and all of this, you always in the end got to follow the money, right? And we use this term reflux, which is when the money comes back. And if there's a problem in selling the commodity that's produced, then of course that's going to extend the turnover period, even with nothing to do with the production process itself, right? And so he makes a point of difference between products which are sold sort of anonymously on the market and products which are made to order. If something's made to order, then the capitalist knows, okay, so I'm going to get a buyer. Okay, right. So the money's going to come back quicker. Production time, which we've already looked at these sort of different components of it. This develops what he's told us earlier from chapter 4. If the production time is extended longer than the active labor process, once again, that means that more capital is going to need to be advanced. And what that will be depends on the nature of the industry. And he distinguishes between industries where some it's very uneven, the amount when circulating capital is needed, and some where it's very even. I mean, the cotton spinning is the absolutely leading example of the evenness, very continuous process. The self-acting mule just kept on running as long as the workers weren't too exhausted to keep running them, sort of thing, or the steam engine was functioning. Very continuous process, right? But in other types of industry, it could be a very interrupted process. And the more there are these interruptions, the more uneven it is. Once again, more capital will be needed to cover the interruptions, sort of the fallow periods when the labour process is not actively adding new value. And so the turnover time, sorry, I should just go back a little bit. The turnover time here is affected by extensions of the production time, okay? And then, of course, the turnover time here can be also affected by extensions in these two, right? The circulation time and the amount of time it takes to buy and sell. So Marx, once again, very methodically, goes through all the different things which could affect how long it takes to sell the stuff once it's been produced. And the question of being made to order or not really affects this. The other thing that affects this, which he brings in, which is important in terms of sort of Britain's role in the world, is where the eventual market is. And in this context, the whole question of connection, say, between Britain and India becomes quite important. And the whole question of international credit, once again, how quickly things get paid for isn't a significant issue in terms of the selling time of the commodities produced. Okay, now we get to chapter 15, and this is, I know I'm getting toward the end of my time, but this is actually, you can take a break if you're not listening live, but this is the one to really get, this chapter 15, because what Marx does here is he brings these together. He sort of brings the two sides he's looked at so far, which is the question of turnover and the question of these different types of period, the circulation time and the production time. He brings it together. Okay. So what is the effect of the circulation time on the magnitude of the capital advanced? He's building on what he's already done in chapter 9. And what he supposes here, the first example is, he says, well, let's say we're in production for 9 weeks, and then let's say it takes 3 weeks to sell the stuff that's been produced. Okay. So the overall turnover time is 12 weeks. It's quite a typical one for him. So we've got the workers and the raw materials require £100 a week. That's the wages and the raw materials. So over 9 weeks, that's £900 has been advanced. Okay. So the capital applied is £100 a week, and the capital advanced is £900 for 9 weeks. Okay. He's just looking at the circulating capital here. Now, when we get to week 10, what's the capitalist going to do? Well, if they want continuous production, they got to invest in a new set of wages and a new set of raw materials and keep production going, right? So we've got a doubling up here. Okay. Some money is not yet, some capital is in the commodity form here. It's not yet come back as money. And this capital is in the productive capital form. Okay, they got to keep the production going, right? If they want to produce at the same scale as they've already done for these 9 weeks, they got to find another £300 until this money comes in. Okay, so instead of £900, it's now £1,200 that they need, and then the £900 will come back. So what you get is this sort of fishbone. I don't know what you call it, a sort of like intersecting Marx's theory of intersectionality of capital, basically. Now, there's another option, which is, okay, so the capitalist hasn't got £1,200, they've only got £900. Well, they're going to have to reduce their scale of production. If they produce only £75 a week, then their £900 would stretch over 12 weeks. And they carry the weight, the overhead, if you like, of the 3 weeks waiting for the stuff to be sold. But after 12 weeks, they would get their £900 back. Okay. So that means they reduce the scale of the production to keep the production continuous, right? And so on, right? For a given capital, have to cut back scale of production for continuous production and cover circulation period that way. Now what Marx does is he gives us one more example, which is a 50-50 split. So it takes 5 weeks to produce and 5 weeks to sell. So you get every after the first round here, after every 5 weeks, a new set of production has gone in and the money comes back from the first set of production, okay? First set of commodities. So you get this sort of effect all the way through the year. He builds this up. I mean, mine's a diagram, making use of this sort of slightly visual aid. But what Marx gives us is this in sort of longhand figures, if you like, right? So every week for 5 weeks here, there's £100 circulating capital. It's waiting to be sold, so there's another £100 a week needed. But when that one's sold, £500 comes back. So by this point, £1,000 has been invested in circulating capital, and 500 has come back. Then another 500 comes back, another 500, another 500, so on. So 10 times that will come back. So in the end, £5,000 over the year, £5,000 will come back. So the amount advanced to keep this going was £1,000, because so it's a doubling up, rather just £500, because the production time is only half the turnover time. You need to double the amount of investment to keep it moving. Okay. Think of the sale as exchange of commodity capital for money capital. Once again, this is coming back to his sort of concretizing the general perspective he gave us in part one. Right. So the ratio between the circulation time and the production time is what matters here. And according to that ratio, it'll affect the amount of circulating capital that needs to be advanced. So this does get quite detailed, and people do, find this slightly. Why do we need to look at all of this in such detail? And in fact, Engels does say this is getting a bit tiresome. Come on, Carl. I know you're an obsessive, but how far do you go with all this, right? The key point is to think of it in terms of the different turnovers of circulating capital and fixed capital, right? That they're both necessary parts of industrial capital, but they take on the monetary, they have to pass over into the monetary form to complete their cycles, right? And these are points that Engels is making, despite his slight, not exactly short temper, but his slight tension with the degree of detail which he's editing here, right? But I think it's really important to understand this whole thing about the multiple payback, actually, a multiple callback. Marx is and he is very obsessively detailed, no question of that, right? But it's a scientific point. He's going to a point which he's going to come back and explain something very big in volume 3, right? So Marx's mode of analysis is vital here for the next 2 chapters as well, right? Because they now bring in surplus value. Now, I've just got a few other things to say. How are we going for time? Yeah, I think we're right. This is a real life example. It doesn't show everything I've been talking about, but just some of the things that we have been looking at, right? So I went to, with London Mining Network, as a team, we went to Anglo-American's annual general meeting last week. In Anglo-American's accounts, EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax and depreciation. So we can see that this company made a gross profit of $10 billion last year, but they deduct depreciation and amortization, because that would be a false figure for their true profit. They deduct the depreciation in particular, and they end up with what is a closer category of genuine profit, which is earnings before interest and taxation, 7.2 billion. And their profit indicator is they take the EBIT figure, which is different for a reason I'll explain in a second, right? And this is the realized surplus value. This is the capital employed, which is effectively the same as capital advanced. And this is their return on capital employed, which is rate of profit. The reason that this figure of 5.4 is different to 7.2 is there are two reasons. It's not an anomaly, it's just a different category, which a lot of mining and oil companies put impairments against their assets. And they, if they, in the case of Anglo, it's a diamond, they write down the value of their assets, basically. There's also a question of when in production, there's a profit they make from the production which they're managing, but also some of the production is joint venture, so they don't actually get the whole of the profit. So that's another one. Now, this is interesting in terms of commodity capital. Okay, what they report in their inventory is that the raw materials coming in are worth 1.1 billion. Okay, and they report that their unsold finished products, in the case of Anglo American, they had a pile up of diamonds, actually, 3.2 billion. So that's a lot of money, right? Of unsold value, which needs to be sold in order to get the money, right? Now, there's another category which actually I don't think Marx brings out, but in business life, and we can, can be added, which is the value of work in progress. So it's, if you like, unfinished intermediate products. They put a valuation on them. Okay, so they're not. Yeah, I mean, there might be things like, of course, in mining, you have to dig the stuff out, then you have to pulverize it, you have to, extract the, smelt it, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole set of intermediate products which they put a value on. Okay, so it's interesting that their commodity capital, just by the way, the figure is a pure coincidence, they're 7.2, but it's of a similar magnitude as their profit. So, this commodity capital is quite a significant issue, right? Of course, I don't believe everything Anglo American says, in particular how they make these profits. So this is a company propaganda, and this is the reality, which is they make the profit because they don't really pay the true cost of what they do. And that's why we were there. And this is the community in Colombia who was smashed by El Cerrejón mine and who have never got justice for it. Okay, before I finish, there's just one more thing. It's the end of this chapter 15. It's Marx does control his variables an awful lot, which puts in terms of levels of abstraction. We know from volume 1 that there's been an awful lot of the dynamic of the capitalist mode of production is about how capital adapts and pushes forward technical change in order to cheapen the commodities that it produces, and at the same time expand the volume of production. Right, this is a really evident dynamic of the capitalist mode of production, right? And so, of course, this affects the change of price. So Marx does look at changes of price and the effect on the transfer of value of constant capital in these examples. Okay, and so that gives it a more interesting, a fuller picture. And the one that is particularly interesting to me is the change in the market price of the product itself, which can be due to different reasons, right? But he does use this phrase, the portion of capital that is not advanced is appropriated from the circulation sphere. What he's kind of saying here is, well, you can have this circumstance where if some commodities are being sold above their value and some below, then there's an appropriation between capitals basically going on in circulation. What one has lost, the other has gained. And this is quite an important effect when we talk about the monopoly characteristics of modern capitalism. Okay, close to the end. I'm not going to I invite comments on this. I have a fair amount to say about David Harvey, but I mean, you can read it and we can discuss it. Yeah, Fox is good. I mean, Fox is a very nice summary, I have to say. He's really sort of stepped forward as the best commentator. I think is our sort of consensus view on this. I have been looking at some of the specialized literature. Duncan Foley is a good example of how Marxist interpretation can get things completely wrong. He actually repeats Adam Smith's mistakes. It's quite remarkable. You could almost change the names and you'd have the same sort of critique. Kim Moody is not sort of overtly theoretical. But he's very good and very interesting on this whole point about just in time and how significant turnover time is for the sort of capitalist organization of industry. And his perspective is very much what that means for worker resistance. So it's a very helpful contemporary study, I think, actually. And then there's more contemporary literature. Yeah, I won't go into that until you read it, really. Okay, so this is the specialized contemporary literature. There are works, but it is a neglected area. And my overall take on this, just to remind you, is that most of the discussion of the connection between volume 2 and volume 3 has focused on part 3 of volume 2, which we'll come on to, which is departments of production. In my view, I want to refocus and really say that what we've been talking about, what I've been talking about, and you've been reading, the whole question of turnover and how it relates to the rate of profit is actually a crucial connection. And with that, I'm finishing my lecture, so I'll stop sharing.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much for that, Andy. Very interesting. I thought. Right, we have well, half an hour or so for discussion. So, anybody got any questions, comments, observations?
Yeah, I've destroyed you. No callback here. no jokes.
I like the references to the comedy. Actually, I've had an argument with our current director of teaching, actually, because I use humor in teaching and lectures, and he thought that was unprofessional. I remember a conversation I had with him where, and I told him that I thought humor was a very serious business, and he looked at me askance, and I think he thought I was joking. So, but I wasn't. It is, as a teaching aid, I think it's extremely useful, helpful, engaging, and so on and so. So I'm a fan of the use of humor generally. I mean, you mentioned a couple of people. I wasn't familiar with those. My favorite's Mark Steele. I don't even come across Mark Steele at all.
Yeah, he's great.
No, I think he's wonderful. He's brilliant. But there are any number of people one could mention in that respect. I think. Anyway, that was just a sort of a warm up for you.
Yeah, I tell you what, the problem in my case anyway, this is sort of like The Office, that I think I'm funny, but the students don't. So. Which reminds me of the famous Bob Monkhouse comment, and you have to be of a certain age, and perhaps, I don't know, class whatever, know who Bob Monkhouse was, right? But he had this famous anecdote. He says, I always knew I wanted to be a comic, and when I was about 16, I told all my friends and relatives I was going to be a comedian, and they just didn't laugh. And they all laughed, right? And then he says, but they're not laughing now.
Very good.
So he got a double.
Yeah, I like that. That's very good.
There's a great quote from Lunacharsky on the 1905 revolution and the explosion after its suppression of really vicious satirical material in Russia. And because the repression had been so vicious that it was very difficult to raise your political voice or voice any opposition. So the literary forms in which the opposition emerged had this deep vitriol.
Yeah.
And Lushkowski has this great quote, and I can't remember it in full, but it's that satire is sometimes on that cusp of a rising class opposition when it hasn't got the organizational force to carry through that criticism politically, but it still finds a voice for it. You know.
But tyrants and despots do not like having been made fun of. That can get you killed. I mean, that is serious shit, I think. Yeah, that's so it's a very powerful political weapon, I think, humor and satire.
And they hate being laughed at.
They do. They've got no sense of humor at all. You know, that's part of the authoritarian personality, I think. It's sort of Pamela's just said Marx uses humor and satire constantly. I don't think we should take that at all seriously.
He's very sharp. A satirist, I think. Yeah, he's very good at it.
The Sigmund Freud book on his Karl Marx and world literature touches on that at a number of points. Good stuff.
Okay, so Oliver. Oh, Amanda, yeah.
Amanda.
Okay. Amanda and I have a discussion about different brands of humor. Oliver has asked a question about Engels.
Okay, sorry, I missed.
Which is a big question, and I'm very happy to start giving my opinion on it. Right. So, I mean, I think people will know this, but just to be sure, right? Just setting the scene. So Marx died in 1883, and he died having published Volume 1. By that time, I think 2 versions in German, 1 in French, and the 1 in Russian was I think it had come out by then, right? So Volume 1 was just off and running, right? He hadn't published Volumes 2 and 3. And Engels knew he was doing stuff, but Marx didn't he kept it a bit of a secret how far he'd go with them, basically. And so Engels was the literary executor, and Marx worked on Volume 2 after he'd finished Volume 1. I mean, all of them went through several drafts, right? So he got an outline of all of them by the time Volume 1 had come out. He'd got a design for the whole thing. But then he returned to Volume 2 and slightly less to Volume 3. But they weren't published, and so Engels looks at them, what Marx left the legacy, and within about a year he managed to put Volume 2 together, right, from the notes that Marx had left. But it took him about 10 years to put Volume 3 together because the notes were more dispersed. It was less of a finished text, basically. So that's the background to the recent discussions. So then we have the question of the mega project. So the mega project has gone in 2 phases. Mega 1 was just after the Russian Revolution, and Mega 2 has been going on for several decades, mostly based on the original German. So a lot of German scholars involved, right? And what they've done is produced all of Marx's notes, as well as the published by Marx or Engels stuff, right? And they're in general, they're quite critical of Engels, okay, on quite a few counts, right? My take is that Engels did a remarkable job, and I don't know, I mean, but okay, so I mean, I've been reading quite a lot of this stuff. There are kind of 2 strands to it. One is, did he, in Volume 3 in particular, did he make Marx be more determinate than his actual texts warrant? Okay, and that's all about the decline of rate of profit type stuff. Okay, but also Marx leaves a note in Volume 3 which says, and turnover. I need to put turnover here. I need a chapter on turnover, right? And Engels wrote that chapter for Volume 3 because he'd already edited Volume 2. He kind of did a summary and put it into Volume 3, right? So what we've been talking about is, and I think Engels did his purpose was completely right, honorable, right, to fulfill that gap, and he makes it clear it's him doing it, right? I've looked at Volume 3 text on turnover, and I think Engels does make some mistakes, I have to say, right, in terms of what we've been looking at now. I mean, they're not mistakes in principle, but they are mistakes in understanding, I would say, what Marx's argument is, and I can explain them if there's interest, right? So there's that whole thing, and then there's another whole thing about Engels, which is like the whole thing about methodology and natural science and dialectics. Is it just about critique of political economy, or is it like a worldview, which I don't go into in particular? I think Engels' historical sensibility sometimes works in his favor and sometimes it works against him, because Marx was incredibly subtle about how he combined in different ways the logical and historical, right? I just don't think, you know, genius level, Marx had it and Engels was just like a good scholar, right? Very, very good scholar. And Engels' sense of history helped him make comments on volume 3, which are really important in my view, right? Because he adds the connection with imperialism of the late 19th century. If you look at Engels' notes on monopoly as it's arising, Marx is actually soft on corporate capitalism. I don't know how to say it otherwise, right? It could be a step, socialization of capital could be the last step before socialism. I mean, Engels would just forget it. It's the first step into modern imperialism, right? Look at Cecil Rhodes. That is the stock exchange of today is Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, right? So Engels' sort of actuality of history is a very, I think, important contribution. Sometimes theoretically, you know, okay, you have to argue maybe not quite so much, but you know, once you understand where Engels is coming from, you know, you can sort of appreciate his tremendous contribution, I think. So, Oliver, I'm not sure if that fully answers your question or hopefully answered it. Anyway, other people, well, let's have a discussion.
We've got Richard and Tim. So, thank you, Oliver, for that. Richard?
Yeah, just to clarify what you said right at the beginning that there was the two big curating projects or the recovery of text.
Yeah.
Then you said, and they were quite critical of Engels. Is it the people who curated, who found and rediscovered the texts or made them public, or is it words of Marx's that were found in the things that were critical of Engels? I just wasn't quite sure who they was.
Yeah, they're the mega two editors who, generally speaking, also sort of merge into what's known as the value form school. I mean, Heinrich is the sort of the epitome of this tendency, Michael Heinrich, I have to say, right? And they say basically that Engels over-edited Marx on the declining rate of profit. They say that he made Marx's argument more determinate than the notebooks Marx left justify. You know, the whole thing about tendencies and counter tendencies. You know, they say the way he organized the material is not true to the spirit of Marx's more open-endedness on it. And I just don't agree with them. I mean, if you look at the whole design, it's why we're going through all this. You can see there's a purposeful design in the whole thing to come to determinacy, right? Which is the combination of production and circulation. And so I just don't accept the content of their argument. And I think it reflects Eurocentric Marxism, basically.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Just to endorse the broad thrust of Andy's defense of Engels' editing, I've been following some of the reservations that have come through during the editing of Mega 2 and Andy's comments on Heinrich. Mosley, I think, took slightly different tack, and in his book on the manuscripts for volume 3, defends the quality of Engels' editing and the truthful, you know, the sticking to trying to make a workable text out of Marx's manuscripts, which wasn't easy. But Mosley, I think, comes to his defense. I would just add it for Oliver's general point, though. There is a guy, and other people might have a view on this, the guy called Norman Levine, who was a bit of a Bettelheim Maoist at one point, who's written a number of books. One was called Marx contra Engels, The Tragic Deception, Marx contra Engels. And he digs really deep into subtle differences in Marx's interpretation of the Hegelian dialectic compared with Engels's interpretation of more Hegel's historic constructions. And he argues that there is a root of a slight methodological difference, but it in the broader scheme of political stance, I think Andy's absolutely correct. But I think it is possible to see some slightly different depth of understanding of Hegel's logic and Marx's deployment of it. Norman Levine was the author. There's an author of the same name who writes novels, which come up on Amazon when you're searching for them. But if you dig for Norman Levine and Tragic Deception, Marx contra Engels, you'll find him.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I actually don't know that work. I'll follow that up as well. I mean, I do have a take
it's
on.
It's not like reading, I might add.
I have a take on Engels and the dialectic, which I'll just come in quickly. I think Engels does. He is an educator, and his Marx has got two critiques of Hegel, basically. One is the idealism materialism one, which Engels gets, and the other is the reactionary revolution one, which I don't think Engels quite got, right, in the same way that Marx did, to be honest with you. And Engels tends to write about the dialectic as being something that can be applied to natural science, social science, and so on. And Marx didn't just apply Hegel's logic, you know, he didn't. He actually subverted it, because Hegel's logic requires one substance subject that develops. Okay, so Marx keeps the idea of developing subject, right? But the essential point is it's not one, it's two. So the basic ontology is critical, right? It's not perfecting the system, it's a system that has to be overthrown. So it's a developing system, but the very nature of the system is different. Therefore, the dialectic of the system cannot be a simple application, right? It's a different dialectic. It's a dialectic of fundamental antagonism, okay, not self-realization. So yeah, so the sort of the political stance affects what you think dialectics is a revolutionary dialectic. So a lot of Marxists have used Soviet writers and so on who try to understand. Lenin says you've got to read Hegel to understand Marx. So of course, people have time on their hands, they go and read Hegel, right? But it doesn't help you an awful lot if you don't understand Marx. You have to understand Marx to understand how he used Hegel, if that makes sense, right? Because there's a revolutionary impetus that Marx was looking for something in Hegel, and you have to understand what that is, right? And it's the overthrow of the capitalist system. So he only uses dialectics insofar as he helps explain why you have to overthrow the capitalist system. I mean, not that Engels was against overthrowing the capitalist system, but it's just a question of the conception of what dialectics is, right? The reworking of the dialectic was greater than, I mean, Engels tend to see it, and he's got a point, right? You can think of everything as being dialectical, you just apply it according to the specific disciplinary area which you're looking at, right? It's just a way of thinking about movement, change, interconnections in the system, and so on, right? But yeah.
The Tony Smith book is good, in my opinion. I'm
Yeah.
really enjoying reading this at the moment. The Logic of Marx's Capital and replies to the Hegelian criticism.
Yeah.
It's a SUNY publication.
There's a connection, but these two strands actually do come together. Okay, so what Heinrich says, okay, is that the Engels tradition is manifest in the sort of official communist parties, right? Which is they got the labor theory of value, but they didn't recognize that Marx also had a value theory of labor. In other words, that you have to look at the social form of the commodity. You have to look at money. That's the value form school. They sort of emphasize exchange value as well as value as part of Marxist theory. And I actually agree with them. I think that's a very fair criticism. I think that part of Marx was actually lost for a couple of generations. But then they take it a step further, right? Because in emphasizing value form, they forget content. That's to put it, right? In emphasizing exchange, they forget the production relations of exploitation, or they downgrade them, quite frankly, right? The social antagonism. So well, how does this all, and what we've been looking at, right? The dialectics is different according to the subject matter. That's one of the general points that Hegel makes, which is right? So how does that apply, right? The contradiction of the commodity is not fixed. It's not the same thing at the beginning of Das Kapital as it is at the end, right? The contradiction of the commodity as the product of labor is in a market society is not the same as the contradiction expressed by the commodity in a society of capitalists exploiting laborers, right? The commodity form changes as you progress through capital. That's my sort of overall interpretive argument, right? So the contradiction between capital and labor is hidden in the commodity form. It's not just about use value and exchange value anymore, right? It's about what produces value, and in its developed form, commodities are reduced to cost plus profits, right? Which completely hide that labor produces value. It all seems like capital produces value, right? So it's not just a simple commodity fetishism, it's a capitalist commodity fetishism, right? Which is that capital is the active agent producing capital, producing value rather than labor. So, I mean, that's the journey that Marx takes, right? So what is a contradiction is more profound in Marx than it is in Hegel, right? It cannot be reconciled. It is a fundamental antagonism that cannot be reconciled within the universe in which it drives and exists, right? It's an explosion. It's a dialectic of explosion, not of reconciliation.
Well, I'll make a comment on
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So obviously Hegel's been interpreted in different ways. So there are some people who say about Hegel exactly what you just said about Marx, the idea that Hegel thinks in terms of contradictions being reconciled is a misreading, and he doesn't, in their view anyway, argue in that way. So I think that's an interpretive issue in the case of Hegel, just as it is in the case of Marx. I think it's sort of
yeah. Well, that's true, but that's where their politics come in, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, you can't separate the politics from the philosophy, in my view, in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, any more?
Yeah. Back to the jokes then.
I mean, I want to maybe just chuck in.
Yeah.
I do find that holding all the elements of this analysis of this stage in my head, I can do it. I can do it when it's in front of me on paper, but in the course of, forgive me, your presentation, Andy, there is a certain mental glazing over.
Yeah.
And I wrestle with this as a, because obviously it's not a problem I think is peculiar just to me.
Not at all.
And
Engels too.
I'm involved. As a kid, I got involved in war games, and I'm a follower of Richard Barbrook's class war games, scenario playing. And I do wonder if there's not a very sophisticated version of Marxist monopoly that we couldn't come up with, which would enable us to actually game out the variables in these things, to allow people to play with the scenarios.
Well, actually, Tim, there is Bertel Ullman, Class Struggle.
But that's not very sophisticated.
Oh well, okay, but it is a game.
There was a prototype of Lenin's imperialism that was being worked out about 12 years ago. It was a group of graduate students, I think, at MIT, but okay. I don't know if, ironically, if it was ever commercialized. Richard's got it.
Yeah. Richard, have you played it? No.
Have you played it, Richard?
Yeah, not that many people enjoy playing it.
Ah.
I do, I do. But I played it with a family once, and it, and there were some teenagers there, and it, well, yeah. Do we really have to?
How many players can the game cope with?
In theory, I think 2, as little as 2, or maybe it's 3 is required.
But maybe we could have a social session at the end.
Yeah, exactly. End of term, we're going to do it.
A board game, 6-player pieces. 3 versions of the rules: beginners, full, and tournament.
So that'll be worth a fortune on eBay, Richard.
Is Bertel almost still alive? Does anyone know?
Yeah, it's.
I don't know.
I saw him about 3 years ago in New York.
Right.
Yeah.
But his book on alienation is very, very good. I think very interesting, actually. Thoughtful and provocative.
And his dialectical investigations.
Yeah, Dance of Dialectics is very good.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, he's very good around. He's a very good sort of way of getting into this question of how Marx, thought about dialectics.
Yeah.
I do find it amazing that after a couple 100 years, there hasn't been better didactic material written on this stuff. We keep in our reading group a couple weeks ago, we were talking about graphic novels or comics, basically. I mean, if the best popular education stuff are those 2 pamphlets, I mean, I still struggle with those.
Yeah.
I mean, Monopoly was actually created by a socialist, wasn't it? It's just that it was taken over by the other side.
I asked a question about Paul Booley, and he's got into left comics, hasn't he? In quite a big way in his latter years.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know who he is. I beg your pardon.
Paul Booley, Buhle, American Marxist historian.
All right.
Buell, I think. I think it's a U sound. Buell, yeah.
Buell.
Yeah.